Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're trying to cut through some of the noise around electric cars versus gasoline cars.
Right, there's a lot out there.
Yeah, so we're looking at the whole life cycle,
Hmm.
from building them to driving them, even what happens at the end.
Exactly. And we'll touch on things like rare earth metals, the bigger polluters, and what it means for you.
Okay, so let's jump in. Manufacturing. I heard building an EV actually creates more emissions up front. Is that right?
Yeah, that's generally true right now. It can be significantly higher in terms of greenhouse gases, maybe 1.3 to 2 times more than a traditional car.
Wow. Why is that?
It really comes down to the battery,
Right.
mining materials like cobalt, lithium, nickel, and then the actual battery manufacturing. It's just very energy intensive.
Hmm. And uses more water too, I read.
It can, yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes up to 50% more water than making a gasoline car. So EVs do start with this kind of environmental debt.
Okay, an initial debt, but what about driving? No tailpipe emissions, that has to count for a lot, right? Especially in cities.
Oh, absolutely. That's a huge immediate win for local air quality, no question.
But the electricity has to come from somewhere. So if your power grid uses coal,
That's the key variable, the grid mix. But even factoring that in, EVs generally come out ahead over their whole lifespan. They're just much more efficient at converting energy to movement.
more efficient, so they eventually pay back that initial manufacturing debt.
Exactly. Depending on the grid and how much you drive, they can break even with the gasoline car, emissions-wise, in maybe, let's say, 1.5 to 2 years. Sometimes less.
Okay, that's faster than I thought. And I guess as the grid gets cleaner, that payback time gets shorter.
Precisely. The cleaner the electricity, the bigger the advantage for EVs becomes over time.
What about the end of the road?
Mm.
We're pretty good at recycling regular cars. EV batteries seem trickier.
They are more complex, definitely. The infrastructure for recycling EV batteries is still ramping up. Right now, a lot of focus is on recycling scrap for making new batteries.
So not tons of old car batteries being recycled yet.
Not on a massive scale, but it's growing. And there's a big push for second life uses, like using old EV batteries for storing solar power at home or for the grid. That extends their useful life considerably.
That makes sense. Okay, let's shift gears. Rare earth metals. Are EVs full of them? Is that a big environmental issue?
Well, they are used, but mostly in the high-strength magnets for the electric motors, not usually the battery itself. Things like neodymium.
And the mining for those. It's pretty damaging.
Traditional mining and processing can be, yes. Habitat destruction, pollution, sometimes toxic waste. It's a real concern. Plus social issues in some regions.
So are we just trading one problem for another?
Well, people are aware of it. There's a big effort to find cleaner sources, better extraction methods, more recycling, and even research into motors that don't need these specific rare earths. It's an active area.
Let's zoom out a bit. When we talk about major polluters, is it really individuals or is it bigger industries?
Individual actions matter, of course, but the lion's share of emissions comes from large-scale industrial activity. Think energy production, especially fossil fuels, transportation overall, agriculture, heavy industry like steel and cement.
Right. I've heard a few big companies are responsible for a huge chunk of historical emissions.
That's true. A relatively small number of major corporations, particularly in the fossil fuel sector, have had an outsized impact.
Which brings up that whole debate.
Hmm.
Individual responsibility versus systemic change. Does my recycling bin really matter next to giant corporations?
It does matter, but maybe not in the way we sometimes think. Interestingly, the concept of the personal carbon footprint was actually popularized by a fossil fuel company, arguably to shift focus.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so reducing your own impact is good, definitely. But we also need those bigger changes in industry and policy. The two aren't mutually exclusive. Consumer demand can push corporations, and regulations set the rules.
What about using economics? Do things like carbon taxes or subsidies for green energy actually help?
They can. The idea is to make pollution more expensive and clean options cheaper or more supported. Regulations like the Clean Air Act are also crucial. It's usually a mix of approaches. There's a growing sense that you can't separate the economy from the environment anymore.
And all this is happening against the backdrop of, well, the climate crisis. What does the science say this means for the average person, say, in the U.S.?
The consensus is clear. The planet's warming due to human activity, and we're seeing the effects. More heat waves, more intense storms, changes in rainfall leading to floods or droughts, wildfires. It varies by region, but the impacts are becoming more obvious.
It sounds like Florida, where I am, is definitely feeling some of that.
Yeah, coastal areas are particularly vulnerable to sea level rise and stronger hurricanes, for instance. There are health risks, too, from heat and changing disease patterns.
Last point, climate justice. This idea that maybe some countries owe more to fix the problem than others.
That's the core of it. Historically, developed nations industrialized first using fossil fuels, so they've put the most cumulative CO2 into the atmosphere. Developing nations' emissions are rising now, but their historical share, and often their per-person emissions, are much lower.
So the idea is common but differentiated responsibilities.
Exactly. Everyone needs to act, but richer nations with that historical responsibility perhaps have a greater obligation to cut emissions faster and also help less wealthy nations adapt and develop cleanly through finance, technology transfer, things like that.
Wow. Okay, so it's definitely not a simple EV's good, gas cars bad picture. It's complicated.
It really is. You have to look at the whole system, the whole life cycle. Manufacturing matters, the grid matters, recycling matters, the sourcing of materials matters.
But the trend seems clear, moving towards cleaner tech, even with the challenges.
Yes, the direction of travel is towards electrification and cleaning up the grid, alongside improving recycling and material sourcing. It requires effort on all fronts, individual choices, corporate innovation, and government policy.
Well, this has given us, and hopefully you, a lot to chew on. Thinking about this whole life cycle, what part makes you most curious to learn more about? That's probably a good starting point for digging deeper. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.